There exists an ancient principle in military strategy that every empire understands. Distance is the best defense system. For 62 years, since the missile crisis of 1962, the United States operated under the comfort of knowing that Russia had no strategic weapons within 5,000 kilometers of its continental territory. But this week, that comfort ended forever. On January 4th, 2026, Russia completed the deployment of Zircon hypersonic missile systems at military installations in Cuba at exactly 90 miles from the coast of Florida. I'm not talking about conventional ballistic missiles that the United States could intercept. I'm talking about weapons that travel at Mach 9, that can change trajectory mid-flight, and against which the American anti-missile defense system worth $18 billion is completely useless. Vladimir Putin. President Miguel Diaz-Canel, two names, two numbers, 90 miles distance from Key West, Florida, and 3 minutes of flight time to Miami. 3 minutes from launch to impact. The Pentagon literally doesn't have enough time to activate evacuation protocols. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is that this wasn't a sudden provocation. This was a calculated response to 34 consecutive months of NATO military expansion toward Russian borders. This was the inevitable result of Washington placing anti-missile defense systems in Poland and Romania that can be converted into offensive attack platforms within hours. I worked in regional security analysis for the IMF for 7 years. I've seen this exact pattern repeat itself in 23 different security crises, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, when you militarily surround a nuclear power, that power will eventually respond symmetrically. Washington just discovered that the laws of geopolitical physics make no exceptions for declining empires. Let me walk you through the catalog of aggressions that the United States has committed against Cuba for over 6 decades, because you need to understand exactly why Havana decided that hosting Russian weapons was preferable to continuing to live under perpetual American threat. On April 17, 1961, 1,400 mercenaries trained and financed by the CIA invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The total budget was $46 million, equivalent to $470 million today. The United States attempted to overthrow the Cuban government through direct military invasion. The operation failed in 72 hours, but established the precedent. Washington considers Cuba territory subject to military intervention whenever it wishes. Documents declassified in 1997 revealed that the CIA executed 638 separate assassination attempts against Fidel Castro between 1961 and 2000. 638 documented attempts in official files of the Senate Church Committee. Explosive cigars, poisoned diving suits, contracts paid to the mafia for $150,000 per assassination. In October 1962, the United States placed Jupiter missiles in Turkey, 150 kilometers from the Soviet border, with 10 minutes flight time to Moscow. When the Soviet Union responded by placing missiles in Cuba, the United States declared this intolerable and threatened total nuclear war. Washington forced Moscow to withdraw its missiles by threatening annihilation, then quietly withdrew its own missiles from Turkey 6 months later. The lesson Cuba learned: the United States can place weapons wherever it wants, but no one else can do the same. The total economic cost of the American embargo against Cuba from 1962 to 2024 exceeds $154 billion, according to the UN. This doesn't include the 3,478 documented deaths attributable to shortage of medical supplies caused by sanctions. For 32 consecutive years, the UN General Assembly voted to condemn the embargo. In 2024, 187 countries in favor of lifting it, 2 against. The only votes against were the United States and Israel. 187 nations consider the embargo illegal under international law. And the ultimate insult: the United States maintains the Guantanamo naval base against Cuban will, pays $4,085 annually that Cuba has refused since 1959, and uses it as a torture prison. Cuba has demanded 47 times that the United States return Guantanamo. Washington has ignored every request. So what happened? Why did Cuba decide that hosting Russian missiles was its best strategic option? The answer is that Washington left Cuba without alternatives. Let me introduce you to the man who didn't sleep last night, Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense. His job is to project military power with $877 billion annually, while facing adversaries who spend less but obtain superior results. His nightmare: Zircons travel at 11,000 kilometers per hour. American response time for conventional ballistic threats, 4 minutes. Zircon flight time to Florida, 3 minutes. Washington, Miami, Tampa, and Atlanta are under direct threat with insufficient warning for evacuation. More than 28 million Americans in immediate range. But the real devastation? This isn't 1962. In 1962, the United States had overwhelming nuclear superiority. In 2026, Russia has complete nuclear parity, hypersonics with no effective defense, and alliances with China, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. The Pentagon attempted 4 strategies in 72 hours. All 4 failed. Strategy 1: threaten Cuba economically. The Secretary of State warned of devastating sanctions. Havana's response: "You've sanctioned us for 64 years. You can't do more damage. But Russia offers us energy, food, investment, and security." Cuba signed agreements with Russia for $2.4 billion. China committed an additional $3.8 billion. Strategy 2: pressure Latin American allies to isolate Cuba. The United States contacted Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina, demanding public condemnation. All 4 refused. Brazil's Lula: "The United States has 750 bases in 80 countries. NATO surrounds Russia. And you complain about missiles 145 kilometers from Florida? The hypocrisy is astonishing." Strategy 3: militarily threaten Russia. The Pentagon prepared precision strikes against Cuban installations. Russia made clear any attack would be treated as direct attack on Russian territory with immediate nuclear response. Putin moved 2 ballistic missile submarines to the Atlantic and elevated nuclear alert. The United States blinked. The attacks were canceled. Strategy 4: offer Cuba an agreement. Washington offered to suspend the embargo, complete diplomatic normalization, and $5 billion in assistance in exchange for rejecting the Russian deployment. Cuba's response: "After 64 years trying to strangle us, now you want to negotiate. The answer is no. We don't negotiate our security with those who tried to assassinate us 638 times." You cannot declare economic war for 6 decades and expect trust when your victim finally finds real protection. Now I want to mention John Mearsheimer, professor at the University of Chicago and the most respected offensive realism theorist in international security. Mearsheimer argues that great powers seek to maximize security by creating spheres of influence around their borders. He repeatedly warned that militarily surrounding Russia would provoke symmetric responses. His exact words from 2015: "If the United States places systems that can become offensive platforms minutes from Moscow, Russia will find a way to do the same near American territory." This is the inescapable logic of great power competition. George Kennan in 1998 warned that expanding NATO toward Eastern Europe would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. He predicted it would inflame nationalist tendencies in Russia and have adverse effects on Russian democracy. Graham Allison of Harvard coined Thucydides' trap to describe tension when an emerging power challenges a hegemon. He documented that in 16 historical cases, 12 resulted in war. His warning: NATO expansion creates conditions that historically lead to military escalation. Cuba 2026 is the physical manifestation of this theory. The United States expanded its military alliance to Russian borders. Russia responds by expanding military presence to American borders. It's not irrational. It's predictable logic of security among great powers. What you're witnessing isn't just Russian missiles in Cuba. It's the collapse of two pillars that sustained American military supremacy for 75 years. First pillar, geographic invulnerability. Since 1945, the United States enjoyed unmatched security because no adversary could project significant military power in the Western Hemisphere. The oceans were natural protective barriers. But now, Russia has permanent presence at 90 miles with weapons without effective defense. China is building port installations in 14 Latin American countries with capacity for military vessels. Iran has defense agreements with Venezuela, including drone technology. The Western Hemisphere is no longer an exclusive American zone. The geographic monopoly has evaporated. The cost: the Pentagon must redistribute massive resources to hemispheric defense that were previously destined for global projection. It spent $18 billion on anti-missile defenses in Europe and Asia. Now it needs an additional $45 billion to protect Florida, Texas, California, and Alaska from hypersonic threats. Every dollar spent defending at home is a dollar not projecting power in the Middle East or Pacific. The United States is being forced to retreat strategically. Second pillar, deterrence through dominant escalation. For 75 years, if an adversary escalated, the United States could counter-escalate to a level the adversary couldn't match. In 2026, this doctrine is dead. Russia has nuclear parity. China has an economy sufficient to sustain massive military spending indefinitely. Hypersonics neutralized aircraft carriers worth $13 billion that are now vulnerable targets. More devastating, BRICS military cooperation creates an alliance that equals or exceeds NATO capabilities in certain dimensions. Russia contributes hypersonics and S-400s. China contributes manufacturing and electronic warfare. Iran contributes drones. North Korea contributes massive artillery. This bloc has combined GDP of 32 trillion, 3.2 billion people, and real technological complementarity. And the part the Pentagon understands but won't say publicly, the United States can no longer win militarily against this coalition. Best scenario, stalemate. Likely scenario, gradual retraction. Worst scenario, nuclear confrontation. Cuba 2026 isn't Cuba 1962. In 1962, the United States held the cards. In 2026, Russia and China have enough cards to make the game too dangerous. Before continuing, critical question. Are you enjoying this analysis? If you value information that corporate news will never cover honestly, I need 3 things now. First, hit that subscribe button. We're over 47,000 people who reject official propaganda and demand real analysis. Join thousands who are waking up to how global military power really works. Second, give it a like right now. YouTube uses this to decide whether to show this content or suppress it. Your like determines whether tens of thousands get access to this information. Third, write in comments where you're watching from. Are you from the United States watching your military empire collapse? From Latin America watching your region gain autonomy after 2 centuries of domination? From Europe recognizing that NATO dragged you into confrontation that never benefited your interests? Share your perspective. This community thrives because it understands geopolitical truth has no nationality. Now let's talk about what this means for your personal life. When the Pentagon requests $45 billion for hypersonic defenses, that money comes from your pocket. It won't be spent on infrastructure, education, or health. The United States needs $4.5 trillion in infrastructure investment this decade, but the military budget consumed $877 billion in 2025. Now the Pentagon demands an additional $45 billion to defend against a threat the United States created through aggressive military expansion. Your taxes will pay for anti-missile systems that probably won't work against hypersonics while your bridges deteriorate. Your taxes will finance 750 bases in 80 countries while your school district cuts programs. But the darker truth, if this escalates, cities in Florida, Georgia, Texas, and California are in direct range of weapons your government cannot intercept. More than 60 million Americans within range of the zircons in Cuba. For 75 years, Americans never seriously thought about military threats to their territory. That era ended. The vulnerability that the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Asia experienced under American military pressure is now something Americans must consider. But the flash of reality the media won't mention. This deployment probably makes war less likely. Historically, peace is maintained through balance of power, not unilateral domination. When one side has overwhelming advantage, it tends to use it. When both can inflict unacceptable damage, both negotiate. The 1962 crisis ended with mutual agreement. Soviet missiles out of Cuba, American missiles out of Turkey. No one wanted nuclear war then. No one wants it now. The multipolar world, where the United States, Russia, China, India, and regional blocs have significant power, may be more stable than the unipolar moment when Washington invaded countries without consequences. For Latin America, this means real autonomy. Cuba can host Russian weapons. Venezuela can sell oil in yuan. Brazil can buy defenses from India or Russia. Mexico can negotiate infrastructure with China without American veto. It's not subordination to new empires. It's real competition among multiple power centers that allows countries to pursue their own interests. It won't be simple. It won't be without risks. It will disrupt the 75-year order, but it's happening. And the Russian deployment in Cuba is the most dramatic manifestation of a global power transition 15 years in development. Stay alert. Stay informed. You are witnessing how the foundations of world order are being reorganized. The next 5 years will determine whether this transition occurs through gradual adjustment or catastrophic confrontation. The difference will depend on whether the United States accepts it's no longer the sole dominant power, or if it attempts to maintain hegemony at any cost. History suggests declining empires rarely retreat peacefully. But nuclear weapons fundamentally change these calculations. Watch how Washington responds in the coming weeks. Watch whether it chooses negotiation or confrontation. Watch whether it recognizes its policies created this situation, or if it blames adversaries for responding rationally to American pressure. And above all, watch who shakes hands with whom. Because in geopolitics, alliances reveal more than 1,000 aircraft carriers. And this week, Cuba shook hands with Russia 90 miles from Florida. The message is clear. The Western Hemisphere is no longer exclusive American territory. The Monroe Doctrine has ended, and no amount of military power can reverse this fundamental reality.